Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Inland Hills Live, and welcome to the first Sunday in 2021. I hope you had a fantastic holiday season. I hope you had a fantastic New Year celebration ringing in the new year, and I hope that you are ready today to jump in and just be right back every single week online, gathering with us, and maybe in the future this year in person as well. But I hope that you're ready more than anything to just jump forward, to move forward, to chase after Jesus in 2021. So excited about the next several weeks that we're going to be going through together. And this week, as we continue through our verse by verse study of the book of Colossians, it could not have mapped out any better. I could not have mapped it out any better than to let you know, and we're going to be talking about Jesus and some incredible pieces, incredible components of power that you and I have through Jesus as we enter into the new year, into 2021. And so let me encourage you now, make sure, set in a reminder, view this every week as we push into the new year. I'm excited about what we're going to cover. No doubt as we get into the new year, we're thinking about goals, or if you do resolutions, maybe a word of the year. All that sort of stuff is relevant. All that stuff is awesome. But I'm telling you, as we plow into 2021, I want to encourage you. And as your pastor, if that's my relationship with you, I want to challenge you today and say, follow after Jesus like you never have in 2021. Hey, if you're new and you're watching for the first or second time today, my name's Isaac. I'm the lead pastor here at Inland Hills Baptist Church, and I just wanted to answer two quick questions for you that you probably have, especially if you are new to us. Maybe a friend shared this video with you, maybe you were invited, maybe you just stumbled upon us on the internet, and that is probably the two questions most people have as they find themselves watching a video like this is, how do I get connected and what's my next step? And actually in the show notes, there are two forms. One is called the connection card. It's just your name and an email address, gives us an opportunity to connect with you and for you to connect with us. I hope you'll tap that. I hope you'll fill that out and allow us to send you some helpful content on a monthly basis. And then of course, the next step, what is my next step? There's a next steps form, and really just gives you an option to take a next step. Whether it's community group, discipleship, just allows you, if you're in that place, to take another step towards Christ, a step towards Jesus. We want you to be able to do that right now. And so come back and watch the video later, but hit that button, fill out those forms. Let us begin to do what our sole mission here at Inland Hills is all about in and with your life, and that is to lead you into a growing relationship with Jesus. Well, look, friend, I'm glad that you're here today. We're going to cover some incredible content. Again, heading into a new year, we're looking for maybe an edge, or maybe some of you, you're looking for that silver bullet. For some of us, we're looking to avoid 2020 at all costs. But friend, I want you to understand as we move into this message today, as we kind of track through a series of messages that are about Jesus and some of these edges and some of these things that we see about Jesus that we can incorporate into our new year, I want you to understand that Jesus gives us some incredible things in these passages that I believe are going to be such a blessing, such an encouragement to you as we head in to 2021. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking for those things, and not just in ways that I can use God, because that's not how this works, but as we'll see Paul kind of disclose and unfold to the believers at Colossae, he's going to help us understand some of the incredibly potential attributes, some of the impressive and powerful realities about Jesus. And I always find that whenever I am looking at Christ, when I'm recognizing who he is and the characteristics about him, I always walk away blessed, encouraged, strengthened, empowered, uplifted. And I believe that's going to be the case for every single one of us today as we talk about these aspects or these realities of Jesus. We're going to be in Colossians 1, verses number 15. And I want you to just out the gate, look at this. It says that Jesus, as Paul writes to these believers, he focuses, as we will for the next 3 weeks, on Jesus. And I just want to encourage all of us as we head into 2021, make Jesus much of the focus. Make Jesus all the focus. Put Jesus at the hub, at the center of the wheel of your life. And I promise you, you will never you will never be steered wrong. You will never regret that decision. But look what Paul says in verse number 15. He says this. He says, he is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. Now, of course, we've talked a little bit about this, but the heresy, right? Paul was writing to Epaphras, who had traveled 1,000 miles, goes and visits Paul in prison, and now comes to have Paul write this letter. And Paul, as he's writing this letter, is dealing with a lot of different things, but one thing for sure, and in particular that we actually see and will be looking at over the next several weeks, is the heresy that Paul is dealing with that was coming within and coming from within this very young church at Colossae. And the heretics in that time, the teachers of non-truth, were trying to teach that Jesus was like an emanation from God. What they would call this is philosophical dualism. In other words, because they believed that matter was evil, and they believed that the Spirit was pure, the Spirit was perfect, there were no flaws, and there was no evil, and there was no sin in the spirit realm. And they believed that there was evil and sin and wickedness in the physical realm. And so this idea that Jesus was God in the flesh, you can understand the problems that they were identifying with this. If God, the Spirit, was perfect and whole and without sin, how could he be embodying matter, which is fundamentally flawed and deviated from God? And so this philosophical dualism was beginning to be pushed out into this church and begin to sideline many, many people in this young congregation. They were claiming then that Jesus was not God in the flesh, but he was rather an emanation from God. He was an emanation like maybe other prophets. He was an emanation like other philosophies, and he was emanating from God, but he was not in fact God. Jesus is not God. He's an emanation from God. And Paul, as he writes to these believers, wants these people to know, to settle this confusion, to not have them chase after fables. He wanted them to understand that Jesus was not an emanation from God. He was in fact God in the flesh. And the reason this was so important is because the heretics then wanted to appeal, because Jesus was not just they wanted to appeal to these people that Jesus was an emanation, not God in the flesh. And so in addition to Jesus, you would need more knowledge, and you would need a deeper understanding, and you would need all these other insights and these other teachers and these other philosophies and this amalgamate within the Roman Empire of other religions, and incorporating all these different components of those religions into Christianity. Because if Jesus is not God, if Jesus is just simply an emanation from God, then certainly the totality of knowing God and experiencing God and being reconciled with God could not come from Jesus alone. And yet again, Paul wants you and me, wanted these believers to understand that Jesus is not an emanation from God. He is not someone who simply comes from God. He is God in the flesh. And this is so important, because when we think about God, as you think about God and your life in relation to you, the question we have to consider, as I'm sure these people would have, is what does God look like? And how does God act? And what would he do? And how would he relate to his created beings? And how would he relate to his world? And the reality, friend, is that you and I have no idea. I don't know why. And you don't know, because God is a spirit. God is not visible. God is not open for our observation. God in his truth, in the reality of who he is a spirit. Jesus even said this as he walked this earth. He sees God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. You see, the reality is we don't know what God looks like, and we don't know his image, and we don't know what he's like, and we don't know how he relates with us. And that is why Jesus is so fundamentally important, because Jesus, as Paul would say here, is the image of God. See, God, the God of the Bible, the God of creation, he's invisible. He's not open to observe. And so Jesus, as he steps onto the pages of history, shows you and me, shows the world, showed his disciples, showed the unbelievers, showed people in his day what God was like. You see, Jesus is the image of God. He is God made visible. If you want to know what makes God cry, you look at Jesus. If you want to know what makes God laugh, you look at Jesus. If you want to know how he treats human beings and the people he's created, you look at Jesus. If you want to know what compassion looks like from God, you look at Jesus. When you look at what hurt looks like from God, you have to look at Jesus. When you look at what joy and purpose and fulfillment is to look like with God, you have to look at Jesus, because Jesus is not an emanation from God. Paul wanted to be clear, he's not an emanation. He's not just someone who comes from God. He is God in the flesh. He is the image of the invisible God. Now, he's not the image of God like you and I are in the image of God. It's been said that man is made in the image of God as much as he can think and feel and decide. And we see in 1 Corinthians 11:7 that the Bible talks about how you and I are made in the image of God. And while Jesus is the image of the invisible God, certainly you and I are made in the image of God. But they're not the same. Again, you and I, as we think, feel, and decide, are the image of God. But we are not made in the image of God essentially. We are not essentially like God. There are characteristics and there are pieces of nature. There are likenesses of God that we embody, but there are also things that we do not embody that God alone embodies. He stands alone. He can do this alone. He can know everything alone. He is all-powerful alone. He is everywhere all at once. And though we may be present and visible and powerful in some ways, we are not made in the likeness of God in the same sense that Jesus is. We are not made in the image of God morally. You see, we're told to be holy and we're told to be like God, but we cannot morally, essentially, be like God. And what Paul, again, telling us here is that Jesus is not, again, someone from God. He is the image of God. I like the image maybe back in the old days where people would write letters and they would use that ink dip, right? And they'd use that feather tip and they'd write those letters and they'd fold it up in an envelope and they'd pour the hot wax and drip it over the seal of the envelope, and then they would put their stamp of maybe their family or a company insignia, and it would stamp, and that image that was on that stick or that peg at the end of it, when it pressed in to that wax, it would leave the image, it would make the impression. And that's exactly the likeness of God as it relates to Jesus. He is the impression. He is the invisible God made visible. He is what is pushed with God, was pushed into reality. It was Jesus. Oftentimes we hear that you and I looking into a mirror is a good way to understand the image of God, but we understand because we're not essentially like God and we're not morally equivalent to God. It's a little bit of flawed image, and you and I are in the image of God, but we're a flawed image. We are a shortcoming image. We are an insufficient image, and yet God, as Paul writes about God, as Paul writes about Jesus, he wants them to know that Jesus is essentially God and he's morally equal with God. He is not just some emanation from God and not just made in some likeness of God, but he is the image, the impression, the God pushed into reality. He is the image of the invisible God. He shows up in reality for you and me. And this is so important because, friend, if you're confused about religion, or if you're confused about God, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He does away with all confusion. He does away with any inconsistencies. He lets us know what he's like. And so, friend, if you're confused about religion, if you're confused about God, if you're confused about, which path and all these different things, if you're hurting and you're going through difficulty and you're looking for God, you need to look no further than Jesus, because he is the image of the invisible God. And for those of us that are followers of Jesus, he is God made visible, and so teaches us and instructs us now how to do life, how to live a job well and do work well, and how to live in married life well. He shows us what God's life is like. He teaches us and instructs us, and he gives us an impression to look at, to know the direction we ought to pursue and what it would look like if God were to do life. Secondly, not only is he the image of the invisible God, but also he's the firstborn of all creation. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses get this verse all kinds of messed up, and you can just empathize and maybe show some pity for them the next time because they're not reading the context. But when the Bible talks about the firstborn of creation, it certainly, and you'll find this in Scripture, it will speak to the aspect of someone being born first. You know, I'm the oldest son. You know, sometimes my mom says I'm the better looking of the two. But my point is, I was born first. I'm the firstborn in my family. I'm the oldest sibling in my family. But it can also speak to the idea of first rank or highest position. And certainly, you know, I'm a veteran, right? And so we have this aspect where, a person is a higher ranking officer. It doesn't mean that they are the first ever and the first only. It simply means they maintain a position of authority. They maintain a position of authority. They are firstborn in that sense, and that's exactly what we see with Jesus here. It's a place of prominence and a place of preeminence. And again, the Jehovah's Witnesses get this all kinds of backwards because they don't read the context. They don't take it at the overarching lesson that Paul is saying here, and we'll kind of look at this in the next portion. But we must read the context, because Paul is not simply saying that Jesus was the one who was born first. He's saying that Jesus possesses and retains a place of preeminence and a place of prominence that no other person can claim. And we must recognize that as so many people, including these heretics, were out speaking about him being an emanation from God and this and that about Jesus, we need to recognize that this is a work of Satan. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, we see Satan and his teachers and false teachers actively trying to blind people from the reality of seeing this reality. That Jesus is not a created being. He's not a born being in the sense of like you and I are. No, he is established in a place of preeminence and prominence by God the Father. And so we must understand, as we think about God being made in the image of God, we must also recognize we head into this new year that God is also the firstborn. Again, not born first, but established as a place of prominence and preeminence in life. And we have to assess, and I needed to assess, and I have to look forward to 2021 and ask myself, if Jesus, by God the Father, is established in a place of prominence and preeminence in the world, in eternity past, in eternity future, then he must and also should maintain and be an established place of prominence and preeminence in my life. And this is the way it's designed to work. And Paul wanted these believers to know Jesus is not an emanation from God in one of the assortments that we put in, one of the gods that we bow down to, and one of the gods that we worship. No, he is the esteemed one. He is the high and holy one. He is the one in prominence and preeminence. And it's the same in my life and in your life. We have to establish Jesus in his preeminent place. I love this series, The Supremacy of Christ. And I cannot think of a better way, a better approach, a better position to place Jesus in 2021 than front and center and at the front and above all in every aspect of your life. Jesus first. It's all about Jesus being placed first. Jesus first in your family in 2021, to where the overarching conversation is not you versus me and not us together, but it is us pursuing Jesus in his proper preeminent place. Jesus first in your business, whether you're working for a business or running for a business or working in a business or launching a business. Jesus first in the church. He is the one who has the preeminence. It is not pastor, it's not the people, it's not a faction, it's not some little group, it's not what we want. No, it's Jesus is first in the church. It's Jesus first with my gifts. I'm not using my gifts to promote myself, and I'm not using my gifts to garner more support for me. No, I'm putting my gifts to work because Jesus alone deserves my gifts. Jesus first in our service. Jesus first in our love. Jesus first in our finances. Jesus first in our worship. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Putting him in the proper, preeminent place. If you've ever done any sort of navigating, you know how important it is to have a compass. And whether that's on Google Maps or Waze or maybe in a compass, they're actually out in the field navigating with a map and protractor and all that crazy stuff. North gives you the position. It gives you the orientation to where you are around everything else. It is what allows you to determine where you are on the map, your position on the globe. And without that true north, without that navigating ability, you will wander in circles. You will die of dehydration. You will not find food. You will not get to where you go. You will not be rescued. You will not move forward. You will not accomplish the mission. You will not get to your objective. And friend, the same is true with Jesus. When Jesus becomes secondary in your life, when he becomes secondary in your family, when Jesus becomes secondary in your finances, when Jesus becomes secondary in your worship, when Jesus becomes secondary in the church and secondary in your business and secondary in your family, you will lose the ability to accomplish the mission, to complete the objective, to have the outcome that God desires for you. Jesus was the firstborn of all creation. Firstborn of all creation. And then lastly, we see here that Paul says, "And for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones and dominions or rulers and authorities." As we head into 2021, I want you to understand that Jesus created everything. We just talked about, if to just read one more verse, they would see that Paul is not saying he's just the born first one. It's clearly establishing the preeminence and the prominence placement of Jesus. He is not an emanation from God. He is the image of God because Jesus is the creator. Jesus is the creator of everything. Of the physical world. Look, right? He says, "For all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones and dominions, rulers and authorities." Listen, everything that you and I see in this world is made by Jesus. We've got a beautiful sun rising this morning, made by Jesus. We've got an incredible galaxy of stars and universes and all these things that we are learning more and more about science, and it's all created by Jesus. He is the creator of all things, visible, invisible, spiritual, material. Listen, everything that you will see and touch in this life, Jesus has created. The sunrises and the sunsets, the mountains and the moons, the galaxies and the molecules, the animals, yes, the ones that are cute and you want to take home, and yes, the ones that you want to avoid and maybe have a gun with you in case they decide to come and try to pet you, right? The made things are made by God, but also the things that you don't see and you don't touch. God made your emotions, and God made your mind, and God has made these things that you and I can articulate, but we can't actually see them. And God is the God who created all these aspects of you that you can see and that you can't see. He's the one that created the angels and the fallen angels and all these principalities and rulers that we see in this world. Jesus made every single bit of it. He goes on and says dominions or rulers or authorities, and he says all things were created through him and for him. And friend, I want you to understand that if it is created by, then it is accountable to. When Jesus created everything, not only did he make everything visible and invisible, but that means every single thing living, breathing, made in this earth is going to be made and is accountable to God. It's accountable to Jesus. The Bible tells us that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. I remember the children as Jesus was traveling and they were singing Hosanna in the highest, and they wanted the kids to be quiet. And Jesus, what did he say? He says, look, if these hold back their praise, the stones would cry out. Why? Because all of creation exists by and for Jesus. We must understand that you and I are not islands to ourselves. We are not the creators of our own destiny. We are not the creators of ourselves. We are created for and by God. If it's created by, it is accountable to. And you and I are not just living our lives in some, fantastical space that we're just never going to give an account, that we just do what we want, that we just go where we want, that we do what we want, and we just live any way we want without any sense of accountability. No, you and I are accountable to the Creator because we are made by the Creator. You and I are accountable to Jesus because Jesus made you and me. He is the Creator to whom we are all accountable. Again, we're not living in isolation to ourselves. Every idle thought, every idle deed, every idle motive, whatever we do and wherever we go in our life is going to give an account before God. The believer will do it at the judgment seat of Christ, and the people that have not placed their faith in Jesus will do it at the great white throne of judgment. And friend, I want you to understand that we are all accountable to Jesus. And so today, as we consider marching into 2021, certainly some of us as followers of Jesus, as disciples of Jesus, we need to maybe assess our 2021, not in light of our goals and dreams and hopes and all these things that we want to accomplish in 2021, but we need to take a fresh look at God and say, Jesus, I am accountable to you. I am living for you. I am made by you. And how can I please you? How can I walk in a way that is honoring and respectful and reverent to you, because you have created me, and that means I'm accountable to you. But then maybe some of you are here watching today, and I would simply say you're not a follower of Jesus. You need to recognize that Jesus is your Creator, and you will stand accountable to Him. And the best way I could put this is to say that we all know the 10 Commandments. We all know that we do things and we say things and we think things that are not pleasing to God. And the question we need to answer is that if you were to stand before God right now, if you were to give that account for your life right now, with all that you've done and all that you've said, would Jesus be able to allow you into heaven? Would Jesus be able to have a relationship with you? And I know that sounds like I'm pushing religion and you need to do better and act better and modify your behavior better. But friend, I've got such a better motive to posit that question to you, because the gospel, the good news, is where I want to take you. I don't want to burden you with religion, and I don't want to defeat you early into 2021. I want to give you a message of hope and of life and of joy and of peace. And the reality is, when God created you to make you accountable to Him, He did so in the idea that you would have perfect, unbridled, unending relationship with Him. But that sin got in the picture. Adam and Eve sinned and decided to go against God and His instruction. They decided to not be accountable to God, and it plunged all of humanity into sin. It plunged all of humanity into wickedness and darkness, to where we started defining good and evil on our own terms. But the reality is you have done the same thing, and we can look all the way back from Adam and Eve, even into your life, that when you decide what is right and wrong, when you decide what is good and bad, it always leads you to a place of brokenness, because it always leads me to a place of brokenness. And when we find ourselves in a place of brokenness, we always try to get ourselves out of brokenness, and we try to sleep with people to heal that brokenness. We try to party to get rid of that brokenness. We maybe try to do drugs or alcohol to get out of that brokenness. We try religion to get out of that brokenness. We try all these different things to get ourselves out of brokenness. And you know what we find? We find ourselves in more brokenness. We find ourselves in that place of guilt and shame and being used and having no value. Because you and I were never designed, you and I have never been able to deliver ourselves out of brokenness. The only thing that can deliver you and me out of brokenness is the gospel, is the good news. And the good news is that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. The good news is that Jesus is God, and He lived a life on earth perfect and devoid of sin, without sin. And He died on a cross for your sin and my sin. He died in our place as our substitute so that you wouldn't have to. And in that miraculous event in which he was crucified for your sin and my sin, he did a miracle and he exchanged his perfection, his godness, his righteousness for your sin and for my sin. And not just past sins, but future sins and present sins. And he was buried, and 3 days later he rose from the grave, proving he was God, proving he was sinless, proving that he was able to do what he claimed he could do. Appeared to over 500 eyewitnesses at one time after his resurrection, so that you and I could know Jesus is God. He died for your sins and in your place, and he is able to give you everlasting life. And from the way that we enter into that relationship, the way we accept that gift, much like you opened a gift on Christmas morning, is you receive that gift by faith. You believe in your heart that Jesus is God. You believe and you trust that he died for your sins, and you ask him to be your Savior. And you can do that right now. You can simply make that prayer and vocalize, Jesus, I believe you're God. I believe you died for me and in my place. And I believe that you resurrected 3 days later. And today I'm placing my life in your hands. Come and live inside of me. Change me, wash me, make me clean. I want to live my life and give my life to you. Friend, I pray that you'll do that today. Listen, you need to understand hell was never designed for you and me. Hell was never designed for people. Hell was always designed for those fallen angels and reserved for them. And yet Jesus invites you and I into a relationship with him to spend eternity forever. Listen, 2021 is here. And I hope that these powerful truths of Jesus, that he's the image, he's not an emanation, he's the image of God, will encourage you today. I hope that you'll recognize that Jesus is established as the firstborn, not because he was born first, but because he has the place of prominence and preeminence in everything. And he needs to have the prominence and preeminence in your life and in my life. And I hope that you'll recognize that everything is created by Jesus. And of course, if it's created by Jesus, then it's created and accountable to Jesus. Look, what in your life needs to bear the image of Jesus in 2021? What needs to conform into the image of Jesus in 2021? What area of your life do you need to look and find the way to do something from Jesus in 2021? Friend, are you willing to place Jesus first, preeminent, prominence in 2021? And friend, what have you had in your life that you've lived as if it's not accountable to God? Listen, we're all going to give an account every year before this, and certainly this year as well. I want to encourage you this morning as we walk into 2021, don't forget, Jesus is where we look to see God on display in life. Follow him, pursue him, model him, match him. Never forget that Jesus is the firstborn and ought to have prominence and preeminence in my life, in our families, in all these different areas. And don't forget that if it's created by, then it's accountable to. You and I were created by Jesus. We will be accountable and are accountable to Jesus. Friends, have a great 2021. I'm praying for you. I'm so excited about what God's going to do in and through your life as we navigate this crazy next year together. Thanks again for being here. Don't forget, connection card, next steps form. Fill those out if you're a first or second time viewer today. Reach out to me if I can be praying for anything for you. God bless you and have a great first week of 2021.